Episode 57 CW February 6, 2025 Beat the cost of eggs with bread-based desserts and eggless cakes. In episode 57 CW 1A World, how can you beat the high cost of eggs? 1B1 choose to bake bread-based desserts which use yeast to leaven instead of using eggs. Make cinnamon rolls for instance instead of angel food cake. Most bread recipes also do not require dairy products. 1B2 rules for replacing eggs in different recipes. 1B3 4 examples of how to replace one egg. 1C United States are eggs safe to eat as bird flu spreads? Here is what experts want you to know. 1D World cows have been infected with a second form of bird flu. A new version of the virus is widespread in wild birds, but had not previously been detected in cows. 2A United States Trump signs executive order calling for review of U.S. funding and ties to UN. The move cast uncertainty on the leadership role of the United States in the global body. 2B United States the Trump cabinet Rosep view medical doctor Senator Cassidy of Louisiana votes in Committee 4. Kennedy Jr. Despite the danger to United States public health of vaccine skeptic Kennedy Jr. leading United States Health and Human Services. 2C United States EPA demotes career employees overseeing science. Rosep view headlines about Trump blocking EPA efforts to slow climate change and headlines about Trump blocking development of clean energy meant to slow climate change, which was one stated goal of the Department of Energy under the Biden administration. 2D United States this is not reform, it is sabotage. Rosep view an opinion writer reacts to Trump blocks on U.S. government public health efforts, both nationally and internationally. 3 California Newsom heads to Washington to meet with Trump. Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governor of California, has tried to cooperate with Trump as he seeks federal aid for wildfire relief. 4 Michigan our bar napkin presidency. Rosep view China is ahead of the United States in development of electric vehicles. Ford began to compete, but Ford may be blocked by Trump edicts. 5 United Kingdom and the European Union. Keir Starmer says he wants ambitious security partnership with EU. The Prime Minister PM says UK does not have to choose between Europe and US before meeting EU leaders in Brussels. Rosep view these meetings in Europe are in response to Trump retreating from leadership on slowing climate change and Trump threats of future tariffs against the UK and European Union countries, as well as Trump demands around NATO membership. 6A Europe Italy Campania region court decision and another case in the court of turn. Lack of action on pollution violates right to life. Europe top human rights court rules. 6B Europe and the United States. 1 economic number has vexed Trump for decades. The trade deficit has long drawn the ire of Trump. Now he is preparing to take it on again. Rosep view Trump evil or just stupid. 7A French government survives no confidence vote. The vote clears the way for final approval of the France 2025 budget, easing concerns about political turmoil in France, but not ending them. Rosep view the face of France is not just Macron these days, but also French Prime Minister Bayrou, who survives by negotiating. 7B France and the United States. The European Union EU will stand up for itself in face of Trump tariffs threat. Macron says French president and other leaders call for cooperation with Washington, but vow a robust response if needed. Rosep view leaders of many European Union countries described how they would retaliate if Trump imposed tariffs. The verbal responses are sorted by country. 8 Russia confirms talks with Trump administration about Ukraine. Russia said that discussions with Washington were underway regarding potential peace talks to end the war nearly 3 years after Moscow full-scale invasion. Rosep view Trump is on the wrong side of history with regard to Russia, to say the least. To be blunt, the editor of Rosep views Trump collusion with Putin to be treasonous to the United States, and covering the details of that collusion further exposes the anti-American Trump character that is also intent on wrecking our planet with unnecessary pollution. It is easy to blame Trump actions on just stupidity, but there is obviously deliberate evil intent. Also 9 China and the United States, how the Trump trade war could affect climate change. Rosep view tariffs on Mexico and Canada. Tariffs are paused for 30 days. Therefore, the following article is edited to include only effects of China tariffs on United States trade and benefits to China, because China is profiting more than the United States from developing clean energy sources. Main content. 1 World, how can you beat the high cost of eggs? If avoiding this egg cost is really important to you, why not stop complaining and start solving the problem? Otherwise, you appear to only be using the high cost of eggs to complain and not even try to solve the problem of bird flu through using the scientific method to develop vaccines against bird flu. 2 solutions, 1A and 1B for using no eggs for dessert items follow. 1B1 choose to bake bread-based desserts which use yeast to leaven instead of using eggs. Make cinnamon rolls for instance instead of angel food cake. Most bread recipes also do not require dairy products. 1B2 rules for replacing eggs in different recipes. For cake-based desserts, use substitutes for eggs and cake like desserts. Avoid eggs and milk which may carry bird flu. Bird flu has now been found in eggs, and raw milk. Eggs can provide baked goods with the moisture, structure, and leavening they need, but a handful of egg substitutes can achieve similar results. When eggs are not an option, pay close attention to your recipe to determine how eggs contribute to the final product. If the recipe lacks liquid ingredients, eggs are likely intended to add moisture. Recipes without leavening agents like baking soda or baking powder may rely on eggs to rise, and those without much flour, nuts, or breadcrumbs probably use eggs to help bind ingredients. Egg-heavy recipes requiring 3 or more eggs per batch may not turn out as intended when using egg substitutes. 4 egg substitutes which are not dairy products follow. See the list of 4 egg substitutes below to find the right substitution in each original recipe. 1B3 4 examples of how to replace 1 egg. 1 applesauce. 1/4 cup of applesauce can work as an egg replacement in baking for dense baked goods like brownies or cookies. While you can use applesauce in cakes and cupcakes, you may need to add an extra 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder to your dry ingredients to create a light and airy final product. 2 cornstarch. Starches like cornstarch are ideal egg substitutes for light, fluffy baked goods like cake, but can also work in custard or pudding. Recipes that typically rely on eggs as a thickening agent replace each egg with 2 tablespoons of cornstarch combined with 3 tablespoons of water, 3 vinegar, and baking soda. Combining vinegar and baking soda creates a chemical reaction that releases carbon dioxide, replacing the leavening typically achieved with eggs to produce light and airy baked goods. You can combine 1 tablespoon of vinegar with 1 teaspoon of baking soda to replace each egg in fluffy confections like strawberry shortcake, cupcakes, lemon cake, or homemade pancakes. 4 oil, water, and baking powder. You can whisk 1 teaspoon of vegetable oil, 2 tablespoons of water, and 2 teaspoons of baking powder together to replace each egg in baked goods like cookies, brownies, or quick breads. 1C United States, are eggs safe to eat as bird flu spreads? Here is what experts want you to know. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, February 5, 2025. Bird flu is striking chickens across the country, causing shortages and pushing up prices at retailers and restaurants. Last week, one of the U.S. largest egg producers said that hens at one of its Indiana farms had tested positive for avian influenza. Researchers have stressed that bird flu still poses a minimal risk to the general public, though that may change as the virus continues to circulate and potentially mutate. But the many empty shelves in stores and higher prices on the eggs that people can find have raised concerns among consumers about the safety of the egg supply. At this point, experts say it is unlikely that an egg contaminated with avian influenza would make it to grocery stores. Federal regulations require that commercially packaged eggs be washed and sanitized, which helps remove virus particles from the outside of the shell. The virus itself also rapidly sickens hens. Egg producers noticing the first infected birds can respond by culling the rest of the flock, and any birds that are infected would likely die of their illnesses before they could produce contaminated eggs. When the virus does affect a flock, its eggs are typically removed from the food supply. Scientists are still trying to figure out whether humans can contract avian influenza by eating or drinking products contaminated with the virus. Most of the at least 66 people infected in the United States since 2024 contracted the virus through contact with sick animals. Still, it seems likely that the virus can be transmitted through certain foods. Monkeys have fallen ill after drinking raw milk that contained the virus. Cats have died after consuming tainted milk and uncooked pet food. The virus is especially prevalent in the udders of cows, which means that unpasteurized milk can contain high concentrations of the virus. Less of the virus may end up in eggs, although it is hard to say for certain without comparative studies. If you ate an uncooked egg, the probability of contracting bird flu from an egg is still pretty low. If you want to be extra cautious, pasteurized egg products like liquid egg whites that come in cartons are considered safe since pasteurization inactivates the virus, and cooking eggs thoroughly kills the virus. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommend cooking eggs to an internal temperature of 165 degrees, meaning that yolks should be firm and that scrambled eggs should not be runny. If people are using good food handling practices and fully cooking their eggs as recommended, then the risk is extremely low. If you are handling raw eggs, wash your hands and cooking surfaces or pans with soap and water after use. Do not eat raw cookie dough or cake batter. 1D World cows have been infected with a second form of bird flu. A new version of the virus is widespread in wild birds, but had not previously been detected in cows. Dozens of cows, one seeming to look directly at the camera in a relatively open area of a barn of a dairy farm. The discovery of a new form of bird flu in American dairy herds suggests that the disease could be difficult to stamp out in cows and may pose a persistent risk to the people who work in the dairy industry. Rozep view D1.1 is the new variant of bird flu found in cows. B3.13 is an older variant of the H1N1 bird flu virus. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. February 5, 2025. Dairy cows in Nevada have been infected with a new form of bird flu that is distinct from the version that has been spreading through herds over the last year. The U.S. Department of Agriculture announced on Wednesday the finding indicates that the virus known as H5N1 has spilled from birds into cows at least twice, leading to these two sets of infections, and that it could continue to do so. It also suggests that the virus may pose a persistent risk to cows and to the people who work closely with them. Before last year, scientists did not know that cows were susceptible to this type of influenza. The news was announced in a news release from the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, a division of the Department of Agriculture. Federal agencies have not held a news briefing on bird flu since Trump took office. The virus that has been spreading through U.S. dairies is a version of H5N1 known as B3.13, which has infected more than 950 herds in 16 states. Scientists believe that it initially jumped to cows from birds about a year ago somewhere in the Texas Panhandle. That transition took scientists by surprise, and this new one even more so. I was kind of under the belief that the bird-to-cow movement was a pretty rare event, said an influenza expert at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. The cows in Nevada were infected with a version of the virus known as D1.1, which has been spreading in wild birds and poultry. It was initially detected in milk collected from a silo as part of a national milk testing strategy announced by the USDA late last year. The D1.1 form of H5N1 has also shown itself to be dangerous to people. Of the 67 Americans known to have become ill with H5N1 so far, the only one who died was infected with this version called D1.1. That person, a Louisiana resident older than 65, had cared for sick and dying birds and died in early January. In November, a 13-year-old Canadian girl also became infected with the D1.1 virus, but it is unclear where she might have acquired it. Her only risk factor was obesity, but she too became seriously ill and was placed on life support because of organ failure. She eventually recovered. Avian influenza is so called because it is best adapted to infecting birds, but in both these individuals, the virus gained mutations during the course of infection that might allow it to better infect people. It is possible that the virus is more permissive for human adaptive mutations, said an immunologist. Reassuringly, the virus did not seem to spread from either person to anyone else. Still, its evolution indicated that it was capable of gaining the ability to efficiently spread among people. So far, at least, the spread of D1.1 to cows does not change the life of the average person, Dr. Moncla said, but it poses risks for dairy workers and the dairy industry. Experts said it also suggests the possibility that cows already infected once with B3.13 could become ill a second time with D1.1. Dr. Webby said, it is no longer just one virus. He said this to me suggests that it is going to be a lingering problem. 2A United States. Trump signs executive order calling for review of U.S. funding and ties to UN. The move cast uncertainty on the leadership role of the United States in the global body. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. February 4, 2025. In addition, the Trump order called for a review of U.S. involvement in UNESCO, which protects World Heritage sites, on allegations that it had exhibited what the White House staff secretary called anti-American bias. The knock-on effects of the aid freeze of the administration are making UN officials increasingly nervous. In addition to hosting the UN headquarters in New York City, the United States is also the UN top donor, contributing about about 22% of its overall budget, followed by China 15% and Japan 8% for 2024. The U.S. contribution was estimated at about $36 billion, which goes toward the UN administrative and peacekeeping budget. The United States is also a major donor to various UN agencies and the UN Annual Global Humanitarian Appeal for money to help populations during conflicts and natural disasters. In 2022, the United States contributed about $18 billion to the UN across the board last year. It paid for 47%, or about $14 billion of the UN global humanitarian efforts. 2B United States. The Trump cabinet Rosep view medical doctor Senator Cassidy of Louisiana votes in committee for Kennedy Jr. despite the danger to United States public health of vaccine skeptic Kennedy Jr. leading United States Health and Human Services. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. PBS NewsHour newsletter February 5, 2025. Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The Senate Finance Committee voted to advance Kennedy in a straight party line vote of 14-13. The Senate Intelligence Committee voted to advance Gabbard 9-8. Both nominations now head to the Senate floor, where they will likely be confirmed unless 4 Republicans oppose them. There are no such Republicans currently. Kennedy key supporter Louisiana Republican San Bill Cassidy, a physician who decried Kennedy, passed false statements about vaccines. He and Kennedy had a long exchange where Kennedy said he is willing to say vaccines are safe if presented the data that did not reassure those who are concerned that Kennedy overseeing national health programs, including vaccination guidelines, would undermine treatment. Son Bill Cassidy of Louisiana said in closing remarks at a confirmation hearing last week that he is struggling with Kennedy nomination days. After the hearing, Cassidy said that the White House assured him of its commitment to protecting vaccines, and he voted yes. Trump has made nominations for all 22 cabinet or cabinet-level positions per the Center for Presidential Transitions. That is a historic pace. 10 of 22 nominees have been confirmed. National security. 4 that includes the Secretaries of Defense, Homeland Security, State, and the CIA Director, Energy and Environment. 3 the Secretaries of Energy, Interior, and the head of the Environmental Protection Agency have been confirmed. Others. 3 the Secretaries of Treasury, Transportation, and Veterans Affairs are also confirmed. 2C United States EPA demotes career employees overseeing science. Rosep view headlines about Trump blocking EPA efforts to slow climate change and headlines about Trump blocking development of clean energy meant to slow climate change, which was one stated goal of the Department of Energy under the Biden administration. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. New York Times February 4, 2025. The Environmental Protection Agency is demoting career employees who oversee scientific research, the enforcement of pollution laws, hazardous waste cleanup, and the EPA Human Resources Department, and will replace them with political appointees. According to 2 people familiar with the approach, the move would give Trump administration loyalists more influence over aspects of the agency that were traditionally led by nonpartisan experts who have served across Republican and Democratic administrations. It would also make it easier for the Trump administration to bypass Congress-related. EPA tells more than 1,000 they could be fired immediately. The Trump halt on climate spending freezes jobs and stalls projects. The pause affects billions of dollars and is delaying home repairs, factory construction, and other projects. Many in states that voted Republican. Chris Wright is confirmed as Secretary of Energy. The former fracking executive said in confirmation hearings that his top priority would be to unleash American energy production. Europe grapples with energy crisis 3 years after Ukraine invasion to wean itself off Russian natural gas. Europe has found new sources of energy, including imports from the United States, but high costs are straining the European Union economy. Chinese carmakers could see windfall from EU emissions rules. European carmakers are urging Brussels to ease regulations to help them avoid buying carbon credits from rivals in increasingly large amounts. State Farm Insurance, the largest homeowners insurance provider in California, asked state insurance regulators on Monday to urgently approve a 22% average rate increase. 2D United States. This is not reform, it is sabotage. Rosep view an opinion writer reacts to Trump blocks on U.S. government public health efforts, both nationally and internationally. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. New York Times opinion February 5, 2025. It is so far worse than I feared. Last Friday, at the end of a week in which a vaccine skeptic and sometime conspiracy theorist auditioned to lead the U.S. nearly $2 trillion, 80,000-person public health apparatus, much of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website went dark. Its weekly mortality reports, its data sets certain guidance for clinicians and patients, all taken offline. CDC researchers were ordered to retract a huge raft of their own already submitted research. Much or all of this will be adjudicated in court in the coming weeks and months, and maybe ultimately overturned or undone. Some initiatives have already been halted in the courts, though it is nevertheless grim to see researchers celebrating that their ability to gain access to data on respiratory illness has been restored. Even more so to scroll through the long list of forbidden words now being purged from CDC research. But many Democrats had spent the transition developing a line of rhetorical attack based on food prices rather than the language of fascism. You could not find CDC surveillance data on hepatitis or tuberculosis either. Throughout the pandemic, conservative critics of these institutions complained that their messaging was unequivocal and heavy-handed. The new message seems to be you are on your own. This is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. message beyond his claims about vaccines in the aftermath of the pandemic emergency. Republican Americans grew distrustful for no logical reason, perhaps through the influence of social media, of organizations like the CDC and FDA, and in nurses, doctors, and pharmacists. But Trump and Kennedy Jr. are not proposing reform. The Kennedy Jr. core focus is asking sweeping questions about vaccines. This emphasis represents a shift from a scientific epidemiological view of illness and disease. Kennedy Jr. was focusing on the horrors of the new vaccines. Indeed, Kennedy Jr. was fighting to stop vaccine authorization and any future authorization for any future COVID vaccine. This was in May 2021. The rollout had begun just 6 months before, but COVID vaccines had already saved nearly 140,000 American lives. In the years that followed, they would save perhaps 3 million more if Kennedy had been successful. The pandemic death toll in this country could have been 3 times as high. This attempt at public health sabotage towers over Kennedy Jr. meddling in Samoa, which may have contributed to the deaths of dozens by measles in 2019, and it came more recently concerning millions of American lives. It was also what earned him a spot in the Trump coalition. Indeed, a starring role. The COVID vaccines were a medical miracle, probably the most consequential American one in several generations. Kennedy did what he could to stop that miracle which he later called the deadliest vaccine ever made when the country encountered a rampaging novel disease. He told us very clearly he would have preferred we all face disease alone. This should be disqualifying. Instead, it proved the opposite in the name of reform and government overhaul. The new administration is approving and ushering in something much more like destruction, with the president imploring his new health secretary to go wild in the role. 3 California Newsom heads to Washington to meet with Trump. Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governor of California, has tried to cooperate with Trump as he seeks federal aid for wildfire relief. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, February 4, 2025. Gavin Newsom of California headed to Washington on Tuesday to meet with Trump and seek disaster aid for Los Angeles communities destroyed in the firestorms of last month. His latest attempt to mend ties with the White House as other Democrats have grown increasingly alarmed by the new administration. Newsom and Trump, who have sparred publicly but also worked closely together during the Trump first term, were scheduled to meet at the White House on Wednesday. Last month, wind-swept wildfires in the Pacific Palisades neighborhood of Los Angeles and Altadena, California, killed 29 people and left thousands of homes in ashes. It is expected to cost tens of billions of dollars to rebuild the damaged communities. Newsom is an ambitious Democrat who spent much of 2024 blasting Trump. He greeted Trump on the tarmac in Los Angeles on January 24th, and the two promised to work together to advance the recovery of the region. The day before the Trump visit, Newsom signed legislation that approved $25 billion for the recovery work, which he said he hoped would be reimbursed by the federal government. On Monday, Democratic lawmakers in California passed a pair of bills to spend $25 million on litigation against the federal government and $25 million to offer legal aid to undocumented immigrants. Newsom in November called for swift legislative action to buttress the state from the Trump conservative agenda, but the governor has said little about the proposals this year, taking a more cooperative approach to dealing with Trump. He left the state on Tuesday without signing the bills, and he cannot take action on them until he returns to California later this week. For Michigan, our bar napkin presidency, Rozep view China is ahead of the United States in development of electric vehicles. Ford began to compete, but Ford may be blocked by Trump edicts. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. New York Times opinion, February 4, 2025. The challenge is how U.S. companies keep pace with China in the industries of the future, including electric vehicles, clean tech, and autonomous cars, when these companies are constantly being whipsawed between Democratic and Republican presidents. In a world where these electric vehicle companies have to make multi-billion-dollar bets 5 years in advance, and they have to make those bets while competing against China. I visited Ford Motor headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan last week to see how it is competing with the China EV juggernaut. Nearly half of new car sales in China are battery electric or plug-in hybrid electric cars, and its companies already control about 60% of the global market for these models. China makes the best car batteries in the world, and any U.S. automaker that wants to be competitive in the EV business today needs battery technology transfer from China. We are talking about a total reversal from 25 years ago, when China needed tech transfer from GM and Ford to build internationally competitive cars. A company like Ford has to balance the desire of its customers for traditional combustion engines, plug-in hybrids, or all-electric vehicles with capabilities for autonomous driving, but it has to do so in a world in which China has made a massive bet on EVs and is perfectly happy to ignore the U.S. market for now and beat Ford and other U.S. manufacturers in Brazil, Indonesia, Europe, and Africa. So if Ford ignores the EV business entirely, it surrenders the rest of the world to China. Ford, like other U.S. automakers, took advantage of incentives offered by the Biden administration to build major EV and battery factories in the U.S. Ford is now near completion of 18 million square foot Blue Oval Battery Park in Marshall, Michigan, which is slated to begin production of lithium iron phosphate LFP batteries in 2026 for Ford EVs. The facility is wholly owned by Ford, a roughly $2 billion investment, but the batteries it will produce for its EVs are based on LFP technology licensed from the Chinese battery giant CATL. It is expected to create about 1,700 jobs. It would have been more, but there has been a slowdown in EV sales in the U.S. because of insufficient charging stations. The Marshall factory was originally slated to be built in Mexico, but because of President Joe Biden EV incentives, Ford moved it to Michigan. Just how the system was supposed to work: give our auto companies production and consumer tax credits until the industry gets up to scale and can survive on its own, exactly what China does, but Ford needed a Chinese battery partner. No American battery manufacturer right now can match CATL batteries, which charge faster and travel farther. China is 10 years ahead in making the batteries for those cars. The way we compete with China is to get access to their IP, just the way they needed ours 20 years ago. Ford is also preparing to begin hiring for the $56 billion, 3,600-acre Blue Oval City factory it is completing in the western Tennessee town of Stanton, which includes a new EV and battery manufacturing facility and a supplier park. Trump revoked the Biden 2021 executive order that sought to ensure that half of all new vehicles sold in the U.S. by 2030 were electric. Trump also ordered a halt to the distribution of unspent government funds for vehicle charging stations from a $5 billion fund, and said that he was considering eliminating the EV tax credits, the foundation on which Ford made the massive bet on these two new factories. Do you know why we are so behind China today on EV batteries? 2 reasons. First, China graduates so many more electrical and automobile engineers than we do, but second, U.S. innovators invented the CATL breakthrough LFP battery technology for EVs, but gave it away to China in the mid-1990s. A compound called lithium iron phosphate LFP, the primary battery chemistry now used by CATL and most battery companies in China, was discovered by scientists at the University of Texas at Austin and commercialized a few years later by the startup A123 Systems LLC, which in 2009 was awarded hundreds of millions of dollars by the Obama administration, hoping it would ignite a U.S. electric car industry, but the demand just was not there yet. So in 2013, the biggest auto parts company then in China purchased A123 out of bankruptcy, and a decade later China controlled 83% of all lithium-ion battery manufacturing. The U.S. is now at least a decade behind China when it comes to battery manufacturing. Beijing understood that it could never win the game of internal combustion engines, so it leapfrogged to the software-defined vehicle that just keeps improving with digital updates. That is the EV, and its cornerstone technology is the battery. The Chinese do not call these cars green, they call them smart. The American way is invent, ignore, leap forward with one administration, and then leap backward with the next, just as the adjacencies of steel, coal, combustion engines, and manual labor created a multiplier effect in the 20th century. The ecosystem of EVs, AI, robotics, advanced batteries, clean tech, autonomous driving systems, and digitized mind labor will do the same in the 21st century. America will be left behind tariffs only by a country time, so its companies can make the necessary changes to compete without walls. The Trump strategy is to hurt our car company exports with a tariff wall. If Trump had any common sense, he would say, I am for all of the above: gasoline cars, plug-in hybrids, all-electric EVs, and autonomous cars. All I care is that you buy American, and to make sure that our great American EV makers can get to scale, I am going to use the money from tariffs to do what the Democrats did not pass: a bill to build a national transmission grid and network of fast charging stations, so anyone who buys an EV will never have to worry about long-distance travel. 5. United Kingdom and the European Union. Keir Starmer says he wants ambitious security partnership with EU. The Prime Minister PM says UK does not have to choose between Europe and US before meeting EU leaders in Brussels. Rozep view these meetings in Europe are in response to Trump retreating from leadership on slowing climate change, and Trump threats of future tariffs against the UK and European Union countries, as well as Trump demands around NATO membership. Excerpts edited by Rozep. 4. Brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 non-profit organization. Monday, February 3, 2025. Keir Starmer has said he wants an ambitious security partnership with the EU while insisting the UK does not have to choose between Europe and the US. The Prime Minister was speaking before meeting EU leaders in Brussels to discuss security and defense, the first time a British leader has attended a European Council meeting since Britain left the EU 5 years ago. Starmer said he wanted an ambitious UK-EU security partnership to bolster NATO, facing criticism that the UK had been vague in its hopes for this pact. He said it should cover military technology, research and development, improved mobility of forces across Europe, protection of critical infrastructure, and deepening industrial collaboration to boost production. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte reiterated that allies needed to spend considerably more than the current target of 2% of GDP. Starmer told European leaders he wanted deeper EU-UK cooperation against state threats and sabotage. He raised the issue following a spate of incidents where subsea cables were damaged, raising suspicions of Russian or Chinese state-sponsored sabotage, with the French President Emmanuel Macron calling for a buy-European armaments policy. Starmer urged EU leaders not to exclude the UK from spending plans. Fragmentation would weaken us all, he said, according to remarks released by Number 10. Instead, let us maximize the industrial weight and clout that we have together in calling for deeper defense industry collaboration. After dinner, the European Council President Antonio Costa told reporters that everyone was delighted to welcome Sir Keir Starmer and to say clearly that the United Kingdom and the European Union are reliable and predictable partners. Costa said he expected the EU and UK to hold a summit in the UK on May 19th to build the closest relationship it will be possible to build together. Managing the negotiations will fall to the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. She said it was very good to have a thorough discussion with Prime Minister Keir Starmer because European security concerns us all inside and outside the European Union. Poland Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who last month said he dreamed of Britain, said it was the moment for the EU and UK to get as close as possible. Again, Poland has the EU rotating presidency, and Tusk said it was his idea to invite Starmer to have the UK as close as possible on security issues and to find ways to eliminate or reduce barriers in trade between the UK and Europe. Before Starmer arrived, the EU 27 held day-long talks to discuss defense, but the meeting was overshadowed by Trump threats to impose tariffs on the bloc. Intense US-EU discussions are planned. UK government officials have already drawn up retaliatory tariffs that could be quickly imposed on US goods if Trump decided to start a trade war. Starmer said the UK did not have to choose between the EU and the US when asked if he would weaken his reset with the bloc to keep Trump happy. The NATO Secretary General downplayed Trump tariff strategy and looming trade war, saying he was absolutely convinced NATO could deal with trade tensions between the US and Canada. Rutte said European defense without NATO was a silly thought and would not work. Arriving at the dinner, Starmer said rejoining the EU was not going to happen, but there could be a better, closer relationship when it comes to trade and security. His trip to Brussels came as reform took a lead over Labour for the first time in a national opinion poll. A Sky News/YouGov poll released on Monday evening put the Nigel Farage party on 25%, a point ahead of Labour. It also found 1 in 5 people who voted Conservative at the last general election would now vote for reform. 6A Europe, Italy Campania region court decision, and another case in the Court of Turin. Lack of action on pollution violates right to life. Europe top human rights court rules. Excerpts edited by Rozep. For brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 non-profit organization. Client Earth, January 31st, 2025. The European Court of Human Rights ECTHR has handed down a seismic ruling holding for the first time that failure to adequately address environmental pollution violates the human right to life. This includes the obligation to inform individuals living in areas affected by pollution so that they be able to assess the risks to their lives and health. The decision comes in a case brought by Italian citizens in response to hazardous fumes and other pollution from widespread illegal waste dumping and burning in the Campania, Italy region that was having devastating impacts on their health. The court has clarified that the government failure to appropriately address this issue, even though it was caused by private parties, has put the state in breach of human rights law. The ruling should have ramifications for existing and prospective cases all over Europe. Client Earth fundamental rights lawyer Malgorzata Quidax-Palash said this ruling confirms that our human rights rely on a healthy environment, including healthy air, water, and soil, and that it is on governments to protect people from environmental threats to life no matter who causes these. For the first time, the court confirmed that environmental pollution can threaten the right to life itself, meaning that governments will be assessed more rigorously with less room for discretion. The right to life triggers strong protection obligations and obligations that governments must engage with proactively, diligently, and in a timely manner because the impacts of its violation are irreversible harm and the loss of life itself. Leading epidemiologist Dr. Fabrizio Bianchi, who submitted supportive arguments to the case, said for years the almost 3 million people in this region have suffered due to toxic pollution, which has been a known risk to their health since at least the 1980s. The local health impacts are clear, from elevated rates of cancer and cardiovascular disease to digestive and urinary ailments. Back in 2019, Client Earth submitted supportive arguments in one of several cases that were later joined and on which the court ruled yesterday. The ruling strengthens the environmental case law of the European Court of Human Rights and will have a strong influence on all human rights cases heard in courts across Europe and the rest of the world. In a separate legal case in Italy, Client Earth is currently supporting a mother who is fighting for recognition of the right of her son to breathe clean air, including under Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights, the provision that the court clarified yesterday. We welcome this important ruling by the European Court of Human Rights on the protection of the right to life affirmed by Article 2 of the Convention. This ruling provides authoritative support for the arguments put forward in the civil case brought before the Court of Turin that the failure of the public administration to take appropriate measures to keep air pollution within legal limits infringes the child claimant human right to life and health. The European Court of Human Rights has the widest jurisdiction of any other human rights court worldwide. Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights protects the right to life itself. Article 8 protects the right to private life. The threshold for finding a violation of Article 2 is higher than for Article 8. Therefore, having found a violation of Article 2, the court held that it was not necessary to examine it separately. About Client Earth. Client Earth is a non-profit organization that uses the law to create systemic change that protects the Earth for and with its inhabitants. We are tackling climate change, protecting nature, and stopping pollution with partners and citizens around the globe. We hold industry and governments to account and defend the right of everyone to a healthy world. From our offices in Europe, Asia, and the USA, we shape, implement, and enforce the law to build a future for our planet in which people and nature can thrive together. 6B. Europe and the United States. One economic number has vexed Trump for decades. The trade deficit has long drawn the ire of Trump. Now he is preparing to take it on again. Rozep view Trump evil or just stupid. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity and relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. February 5, 2025. To President Trump. One economic number represents everything that is wrong with the global economy. America trade deficit. That deficit is the total value of what the United States imports from other nations minus its exports to other countries. The fact that America runs a trade deficit reflects how the national appetite for foreign goods now far outpaces what U.S. factories and farms send abroad. The U.S. trade deficit widened to nearly $12 trillion in 2024. For Trump, the fact that the United States imports more goods than it exports is a sign of economic weakness and evidence that the world is taking advantage of America. The Trump pick to head the Council of Economic Advisors has argued that tariffs could help to offset big macroeconomic imbalances while also creating a source of revenue and leverage in negotiations. Some economists say this will not work, and instead tariffs would have an ambiguous effect on the trade deficit, in part because they would strengthen the U.S. dollar when the currency appreciates. That makes imports seem cheaper and exports more expensive, pushing up the trade deficit. Tariffs can also make it more expensive for American factories to import raw materials and parts they need, and therefore can increase the trade deficit by hurting U.S. exporters. There is a whole range of macroeconomic reactions that would tend to undermine the simple intuition of how tariffs affect the balance of trade. Other economists believe that Trump officials have identified the correct problem, but are not confident that they will choose the best solutions. Instead of applying tariffs, the United States should form a coalition of countries to pressure China to change its trade behaviors or impose a tax on foreign capital coming into the United States, which could weaken the dollar and push down the trade deficit. China continues to sell far more products to the rest of the world than it buys. China announced in January that its trade surplus reached almost $1 trillion last year, far exceeding that of any country in the past century. The United States has tried to support firms making solar panels, computer chips, and other strategic products against this flood of products by offering generous subsidies, but some companies have still struggled to survive. Trade data released on Wednesday showed a significant drop in U.S. automotive exports to the rest of the world as the industry faces stiff competition from China. 7A. French government survives no confidence vote. The vote clears the way for final approval of the France 2025 budget, easing concerns about political turmoil in France, but not ending them. Rozep view the face of France is not just Macron these days, but also French Prime Minister Bayrou, who survives by negotiating. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity and relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times. February 5, 2025. The government of France lived to see another day on Wednesday after it survived a no-confidence vote in parliament and gave the recently appointed prime minister a reprieve from months of political turmoil in the country, a promise of stability. The no-confidence motion was supported by only 128 lawmakers in the 577-seat National Assembly, the lower house of France. Short of the absolute majority required, had it passed, the motion would have forced the centrist Prime Minister François Bayrou and his cabinet to resign. The failure of the motion ensures safe passage of a 2025 budget bill that France needs badly. France has been operating with temporary stopgap funding since the start of the year. The government hopes the budget bill will rein in the surging debt of France and deficit with a goal of generating 50 billion euros in savings through tax increases and spending cuts. The budget bill now goes to the Senate for final approval on Thursday. On Wednesday, Bayrou passed through a second no-confidence motion triggered by another budget bill on healthcare and other social security expenses. The bigger problem for Bayrou of running a government in hostile territory has not been solved. The lower house is deeply divided, with a centrist conservative bloc that supports him and two main opposition wings, a tenuous alliance of left-wing parties called the New Popular Front and the anti-immigrant far-right National Rally Party that do not support Bayrou. Bayrou, a centrist ally of President Emmanuel Macron, was appointed just over a month ago, is the fourth prime minister in a year, unusual for France. Bayrou listed challenges including the war in Ukraine and President Trump foreign policy. The no-confidence motion on Wednesday was put forward by the hard-left France Unbowed Party. This time Bayrou actively courted and negotiated with the Socialist Party, which decided to abstain from supporting the no-confidence motion despite cries of treason from its allies in the New Popular Front. The far-right National Rally announced this week that it would not vote for the no-confidence motion. Both parties denounced the budget as bad. Both also argued that prolonging political instability was irresponsible. The Socialist Party ensured that 4,000 teaching positions would not be cut. 7B. France and the United States. The European Union (EU) will stand up for itself in face of Trump tariffs threat. Macron says French President and other leaders call for cooperation with Washington, but vow a robust response if needed. Rozep view leaders of many European Union countries described how they would retaliate if Trump imposed tariffs. The verbal responses are sorted by country. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 non-profit organization. 7b1 Denmark. The Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said Copenhagen would generally never support fighting allies, but if the Trump administration imposes tough tariffs on Europe, we need a collective and robust response. 7b2 Finland. The Finland Prime Minister Petteri Orpo also said Europe must negotiate with Trump on trade. I am not going to start a war, I want to start negotiations, he said, adding that the biggest threat to Europe was Russia. 7b3 European Union. Rozep view in the article below. Leaders in France, Germany, Ireland, Luxembourg, Poland, and Spain reacted to the threat of Trump tariffs on their countries. 7b4 France. Emmanuel Macron has said as the bloc leaders urge talks, but a firm response if needed in response to the Trump weekend threat to impose punishing tariffs. If our commercial interests are attacked, Europe as a true power will have to make itself respected and therefore react, the French president said as he arrived for an informal defense meeting with other leaders in Brussels on Monday. The latest choices and statements by the Trump administration were pushing the EU to be more united and more active to respond to issues of collective security, he said. The French industry minister Marc Ferracci told France Info Radio on Sunday night that trade talks with Washington must embody a form of power dynamic. The bloc must wait for the Trump final decision, but a response should be prepared now, he said. To be effective, any response must focus on products that are important to the U.S. and be biting, meaning it must have an impact on the American economy to have a credible threat in negotiations. The governor of the France Central Bank, François Villeroy de Galha, said the tariffs Trump had already imposed were brutal, they would increase economic uncertainty, and were a worrying development, he said. 7b5 Germany. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the EU was strong enough to react to any U.S. trade levies, but the goal should be that things result in cooperation. German conservative opposition leader Friedrich Merz, who is expected to become the next Chancellor of Germany, said Trump would swiftly realize the tariffs he imposes will not have to be paid by those who import into America, but by consumers in America. 7b6 Ireland. The Ireland Prime Minister Michael Martin said the EU and U.S. need to work together constructively on trade because protectionism would hurt citizens wherever they reside. 7b7 Luxembourg. The Luxembourg Prime Minister Luc Frieden said the answer to trade tariffs was to reply with the same measures, though tariffs were always bad. 7b8 Poland. The Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said a trade war was a complete mistake and everything possible must be done to stop allies fighting in the face of a Russian threat or Chinese expansion. 7b9 Spain. The Spanish Economy Minister Carlos Cuerpo told RNE Radio that although the EU is open to trade and in favor of a globalized market, it should not be naive and would protect its companies to ensure they were in a position to compete on a level playing field. Global stock markets come under pressure amid Trump tariff tantrum. 7b10 Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 non-profit organization. The Guardian, Monday, February 3, 2025. The EU will stand up for itself if its interests are targeted. The bloc foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas said there would be no winners in a trade war. Europe and the U.S. needed each other, she said. He said on Sunday night that new tariffs on the EU would definitely happen. The U.S. president repeated long-standing complaints about the size of the U.S. trade deficit with the bloc and demanded Europe import more American cars and farm products. It will definitely happen with the EU. I can tell you that, he said. Trump said that although there was no specific timeline for European tariffs, it was going to be pretty soon. He told reporters on Friday he would absolutely impose them. The European Union has treated us so terribly, he said, speaking after a day of talks overshadowed by Trump threat of tariffs. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the EU was ready for robust but constructive dialogue with the U.S. when targeted unfairly or arbitrarily. The European Union will respond firmly, she added. She said the steep tariffs imposed on Canada and Mexico and then paused would raise business costs, harm workers and consumers, and create unnecessary economic disruption. During his first term, Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminium imports from the EU, which retaliated with trade levies on emblematic U.S. goods from Republican states such as Harley-Davidson motorbikes, bourbon, denim, and orange juice. Leaders called for more dialogue with Washington. Others attending the meeting stressed the need for a firm, united response. The NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said it was clear the U.S. was selling much more defense equipment to Europe than vice versa, and that there was more money to come as European NATO allies increased defense spending. 8 Russia confirms talks with Trump administration about Ukraine. Russia said that discussions with Washington were underway regarding potential peace talks to end the war nearly 3 years after Moscow full-scale invasion. Rozep view Trump is on the wrong side of history with regard to Russia, to say the least. To be blunt, the editor of Rozep views Trump collusion with Putin to be treasonous to the United States, and covering the details of that collusion further exposes the anti-American Trump character that is also intent on wrecking our planet with unnecessary pollution. It is easy to blame Trump actions on just stupidity, but there is obviously deliberate evil intent. Also excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 non-profit organization. February 5, 2025. The Kremlin confirmed on Wednesday it had established contact with the Trump administration as discussions begin about the possibility of holding peace talks to end the war in Ukraine. There are indeed contacts between individual departments, and they have intensified recently, but I cannot tell you any other details. Dmitry S. Peskov, the spokesman for President Vladimir V. Putin, said during a call with reporters Russia has long sought to negotiate directly with the United States and cut out Ukraine, and its questioning of Zelensky legitimacy could be designed to undercut the Zelensky authority in the eyes of the Trump administration and strike a deal without Zelensky. Trump, who has long been critical of U.S. aid to Ukraine, said this week that he wanted Ukraine to supply the United States with rare earth minerals in exchange for supporting the Kyiv war effort. Peskov seized upon those comments to paint Ukraine's support from the United States as flimsy, saying such a deal would be a proposal to buy help 9. China and the United States, how the Trump trade war could affect climate change. ROSEP view tariffs on Mexico and Canada tariffs are paused for 30 days. Therefore, the following article is edited to include only effects of China tariffs on United States trade and benefits to China, because China is profiting more than the United States from developing clean energy sources. Excerpts edited by ROSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 non-profit organization. The New York Times, February 4, 2025. The trade war of Trump has begun with tariffs against all Chinese imports going into effect today. The effect of these disputes is already being felt worldwide. Global markets gyrated on Monday and China retaliated with penalties of its own. Already, China has announced a new 15% tax on coal and natural gas imported from the United States and a 10% tax on crude oil. Those levies could dampen U.S. exports. We have U.S. oil and gas exports going all over the world now, and those are in jeopardy. China tariffs could also slow global efforts to reduce planet-warming emissions. A country like China could increase its gas imports from Russia rather than continuing to import from the United States. China in recent years under both Biden and Trump, the United States has introduced a series of levies on imported Chinese solar panels. While that dampened sales of Chinese solar panels in the U.S., other countries were willing to buy the cheap Chinese exports. If it gets more expensive to manufacture renewable energy products in the United States, other countries likely will pick up the slack. Other countries would simply buy more clean energy technologies from China, Japan, and Korea. It is puzzling why the United States would want to cede those markets to China and Japan.